All right.
So we've covered the Cold War in quite a bit of detail, but I want to go back to it. So the United States invested about $12 billion in the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe and to contain the spread of communism. Right? So the United States didn't spend $12 billion just because Americans are really nice people. There was a motive and a rationale to it, and that was the policy of containment. In addition to rebuilding Western Europe, the United States spent money rebuilding West Germany and Japan, two countries that America fought in World War II, and they also gave aid to Turkey and Greece. And so that's part of what's known as the Truman Doctrine, which is a key Cold War term that we already went over. We also talked about the Iron Curtain, right? Winston Churchill says, an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. And who remembers what that Iron Curtain referred to? What Churchill meant by that? Yeah.
They split between Western and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, what was that split? What was the Iron Curtain part of it?
Was it economic-wise?
It had to do with economics. Which economic system did Churchill warn? Was it?
Capitalism and communism?
Yeah, so when Churchill said an Iron Curtain has fallen upon Europe, he's saying the Soviet Union is taking over the continent, or at least the eastern part of the continent. Right, so Churchill was giving a warning, this is going to be a problem, right? And Churchill gets voted out of office because Great Britain is tired of war and tired of maintaining its empire, whereas Churchill wanted to keep the empire going. Okay, so that's all the review that you guys should hopefully know those key terms. Containment, Churchill's quote about the Iron Curtain and the spread of communism, Truman Doctrine, right? Harry Truman was the president of the United States at the beginning of the Cold War and World War II. And he says, we'll support non-communist free people anywhere we can because we want to contain communism. Okay? So, we're going to get more into China. Hopefully you read about China over spring break in chapter 22. But before we get there, into chapter 22, the first thing we need to know is that China is the first domino to fall. Right? So America loses China. So another key term is the domino theory. Right? So America was afraid that once one country in an area went communist, what would happen to other countries? Okay.
They would be communist.
Yeah, the dominoes would keep falling. And so we'll see, well, we know that theory was overly simplistic and problematic because we talked about the Vietnam War, like Minerva.
Can you remind us what the first Red Scare?
Yeah, so the first Red Scare, does anybody remember in the 1920s what the first Red Scare was about? It had to do with the Palmer raids and an Attorney General of the United States. Yeah, Tiffany.
It's when basically anyone that would have connections with communism or like anything related to communism would get kicked out or deported.
Yeah, so America, the federal government in the 1920s, once Russia completed its communist revolution, America was very worried about the spread of communism at that time. And they were worried about communists and socialists within the United States. So one tool at the Attorney General's disposal was to deport people who were socialists or communists. Another tool was to investigate people who were citizens who might have communist leanings. And then the second Red Scare was led by whom? What senator was big on investigating communism during the Cold War? And there's a key Cold War term that has his name in it. McCarthyism, yeah. So Senator Joseph McCarthy was the loudest individual leading the second Red Scare in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it starts with McCarthy and other right-wing Republicans saying that the Democrats lost China. Harry Truman and his administration did not do enough to keep China from going communist. We should have intervened more to help Chiang Kai-shek defeat Mao Zedong. the leader of the communists, right? So that was the beginning of the Second Red Scare. Additionally, the Soviet Union had acquired nuclear weapons. And so part of the fear for the United States was that, well, it was somewhat well-founded, there were American spies working with the Russians. That's how the Russians acquired the ability to make nuclear weapons. So part of the fear was legitimate, but then McCarthy used it to basically investigate people randomly and to restrict people's civil liberties, right to join political parties, and the right to free speech and have communist beliefs, right? So yeah, America's a free country. If you want to be a communist, why can't you be a communist? Well, during the Cold War, communism threatened the well-being of the United States, right?
Sorry for the interruption. Nehemiah added to the front office. Nehemiah added to the front office.
So Senator Joseph McCarthy, Richard Nixon, who goes on to be president, he also used what's called red baiting, right? You accuse your opponent or somebody you don't like of being a communist, right? You don't love America, you're a communist, you're bad, right? So I'm oversimplifying the Red Scare because we have to keep moving, but you'll definitely study it in more depth in American history next year. But it's important to know that China goes communist, Mao Zedong and the communist forces defeat Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces in China. And that's a big problem because China is a huge country, the massive economy, and now they are in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence and not a trading partner with the United States. We'll learn more about Mao tomorrow, and you've probably read more about him in the textbook. But the loss of China is sort of the first domino to fall in the Cold War, and it's a big scandal. The Truman administration gets blamed for not doing enough, right? So today, what we're going to focus on is the Korean War. We talked at length about Vietnam. You guys did an Achieve article about Vietnam. I skipped over the Korean War a couple weeks ago because we had the midterm coming up, but I want to go back to it today. So this is the first proxy war of the Cold War. Now, what's that term proxy war mean? Yeah, Alexi.
Like smaller war?
It's a,
Or like main?
it's a smaller war, and it's part of the larger Cold War conflict, right? So in World War II, at the end of World War II, America and Russia are going to be the two superpowers left in the world. And so they decide, let's just divide Korea at the 38th parallel, right? So let's take a look at a map here of Korea. So this is North Korea, which is still a communist country to this day. And here's South Korea, which is a capitalist country to this day. This is the 38th parallel that divides the two countries. And so North Korea in 1950 decides, you know what, let's just make it a communist country. So North Korean forces invade South Korea and push the South Koreans all the way deeper into the South. America is focused on rebuilding Japan at this time, so they were not really prepared for the invasion. General Douglas MacArthur, the hero on the American side in World War II, has a brilliant plan. He lands American forces behind enemy lines at a place called Incheon. So the Incheon landing was a famous military maneuver. And the Americans are able to drive the North Koreans out of South Korea pretty quickly. So that should have been the end of it, right? But what happens next? What does Mr. MacArthur do? Justin.
He tries to push them like back even more. Right?
Exactly. He says, you know what? Enough of this North Korea stuff. Let's just make it Korea and let's just make it capitalist. What's the problem with this decision to try to conquer North Korea, though? Yeah, Brian.
It's on their turn.
It's on their turf. You're fighting on their terrain. Anna.
The Chinese were up there waiting for the American stuff.
Yeah, so China shares a border with North Korea, and they didn't really want American forces on their border. They were also allied with North Korea. So China sends in forces to assist the North Koreans. And so the war, which should have been just a short conflict, turns into a 3-year stalemate, with American and South Korean forces fighting North Korean and Chinese forces. who were supported by the Soviet Union. The war ends up in a stalemate, neither side wins, and to this day, South Korea is a capitalist country, North Korea is still a communist dictatorship. So Kim Il-sung is the grandfather of the current North Korean dictator, and he was the first communist dictator, and then his son took over, and then when his son passed away, now the grandson, Kim Jong-un, is in power. So Kim Il-sung, forget the name of the second North Korean dictator, and then now the son. We'll look that up. So, I think we covered it all. Yeah. And there was some confusion on the American side as to whether or not China would intervene. You're going to see a CIA report today that says China's not going to bother to intervene. They're not strong enough. They wouldn't do it. Other sources, though, say, obviously, China is not going to let America just wipe out its ally. And so General MacArthur ultimately gets fired by President Truman for the disastrous decision to invade North Korea. Okay, any any confusion about the Korean War? Why didn't America just drop a nuclear bomb on North Korea? It worked to end World War II and defeat China. So why didn't the Americans just drop atomic bombs on Buyang?
Then they might start a nuclear war.
Exactly. It's one thing to drop a nuclear weapon on an enemy, Japan, that didn't have nuclear weapons. But North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union, who had nuclear weapons. So you risked retaliation. And that's why President Truman, who had made the decision to drop nuclear bombs on Japan, chose not to drop nuclear bombs on North Korea. All right? Okay. So, what we're going to do, we're going to practice our DBQ writing. This one's not going to be as challenging, I think, as the last one, and this is not off of the exam. But I think some of these documents are a little bit more clear. So you're going to analyze at least 6 of these documents, and then write a DBQ essay in which you explain what caused the Korean War and how the war connects to the Cold War. All right, how does this conflict connect to the global patterns of the Cold War? Okay. All right. Let me pass these out. So I'm going to actually collect these back from you because I had problems with the copier today. Feel free to underline though. What's that? No, you will. You will. I'm just saying at the end of class I'm going to take these back. 2, 4, 6, 7. Okay. All right, so I'll get us started. Does everybody have a copy of the packet? Yes. Okay, I'll get us started. So, origins of the Korean War. So Dean Rusk eventually becomes the American Secretary of State, so he's the source for this first document. During a meeting on August 14th, 1945, Colonel Charles Bonesteel and I retired to an adjacent room late at night and studied intently a map of the Korean Peninsula. Working in haste and under great pressure, we had a formidable task. So pick a zone for